Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're heading back to ancient Greece to explore the world of oracles.
Ah, oracles.
And our guide for this journey is an academic paper called Oracles and Divine Inspiration.
By Bernard C. Dietrich, yeah.
Exactly.
A fascinating paper. Really gets into some interesting stuff about the evolution of prophecy in Greece.
So we often think of, like the oracle at Delphi and it all being very mystical and mysterious. But it sounds like you're saying there was more to it, that it actually started out a lot more practical.
Well, it really did.
Yep.
In the beginning, it was all about understanding the gods well, but by looking at the world around you. The flight of birds, maybe the patterns in an animal's entrails.
You're reading the signs.
Exactly. And this is what scholars call inductive prophecy.
So less about a god, directly speaking to you, more about just really skilled interpretation.
Exactly. It's all about observation, making connections, and then using that knowledge to try to understand what the gods were up to.
And this, this evolution of prophecy, it's fascinating that it actually kind of mirrors a bigger shift in how the Greeks understood their relationship with the divine, with the gods.
It really does, yeah. And to really kind of understand this evolution, I think it's helpful to start with a myth, actually. The story of a boy named Glaucus.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Well, Glaucus was the son of King Minos. And he had this very unfortunate incident where he drowned in honey.
Drowned in honey?
Yeah. Fell into a honey jar. You know how it is.
Of course. Classic childhood mishap.
Everyone thought he was dead. But
Yeah.
then this seer, Polyidus, he managed to revive him.
Oh, wow.
But here's the really interesting part. The myth says that after bringing Glaucus back to life, Polyidus then took back his prophetic gift by spitting in his mouth.
Wait, what? Spitting in his mouth?
Yeah, I know. It's a bit of a strange image.
That's one way to put it. But how does, a honey-filled death and some strategic spitting relate to, this bigger story of oracles?
So that detail about spitting, some scholars think it was probably added to the myth later on.
Gross.
And it's significant because it implies this later idea that a god speaks directly through a human.
Like the Pythia, the priestess at Delphi.
Exactly. It's different from the earlier idea where prophecy was more about renewal through contact with the divine, like Glaucus being revived.
So this myth, it's almost like we're seeing two different ideas about prophecy all wrapped up in this one sticky story.
I love that. Yeah, you're exactly right.
Okay, so we've got these two ideas. But if we want to really understand how prophecy worked, way back in ancient Greece, I guess we have to go to the source, right?
You got to go to Homer.
Homer, of course, the OG storyteller.
Right. I mean, his epics, they're a gold mine of information about early Greek beliefs, including, how they saw prophecy.
So what can Homer tell us?
Well, for Homer, prophecy relied heavily on that inductive reasoning we were talking about before, observing signs and omens in the world around them.
Okay, so examples.
Sure, remember Calchas in the Iliad?
Vaguely. Remind me.
He's the one who figures out why this plague has hit the Greek camp.
Oh, right.
And he does it by, observing the flight of birds, interpreting the signs.
So he's almost like a proto-scientist, looking for patterns and clues.
Exactly. He's using his knowledge to understand the will of the gods.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
And, even the prophecies that seem really intuitive or just a feeling, they're usually based on something someone's observed.
Okay, like what?
Well, there's this scene where Penelope has a dream, right, about an eagle killing her geese.
Sounds ominous.
And she interprets that as an omen.
So even in her dreams, the Greeks are looking for signs from the gods.
Always looking for those signs, trying to figure out what the gods are trying to tell them.
It's fascinating. But we know things eventually change. When do we start to see that shift towards oracles as, mouthpieces for the gods?
Well, we start to see hints of that as we move beyond Homer. Thinkers like Plato, he started grouping things like prophecy and poetry, even rituals like the ones dedicated to Dionysus, under this big concept of mania.
Mania. Like madness.
Well, it's more like divine possession or inspiration, being overwhelmed by a god.
So that's where we get that image of the oracle, like the Pythia, just being completely taken over by the god.
It's tempting to make that connection, but it's important to remember that these ideas evolved over time.
Right.
And when you read Homer, his seers and prophets, they're not like that. They're not in these ecstatic states. They're calm, they're collected.
So it's not this sudden dramatic shift. It's a more gradual evolution.
Exactly. More like a slow burn.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about Delphi? Like, that's the place everyone thinks of when they hear oracle. Was it always the center of the prophecy world?
It might surprise you to learn that Delphi and Apollo, they don't actually play a huge role in Homeric prophecy.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, the main source of oracles in those early days was actually Zeus, particularly at his oracle in Dodona.
Wait, so the god most people associate with oracles, he wasn't even the central figure early on.
It's true. Apollo was more like an intermediary. He conveyed Zeus's messages.
That's wild.
Right. And if we want to go even further back, well, we have to turn to these Mycenaean linear B tablets. They give us a glimpse, into prophecy way back in the Bronze Age.
Ah, the linear B tablets, always a good time.
They're like a giant puzzle, right?
Absolutely.
But they do offer some clues. There are these words on some tablets that seem to be titles, maybe for prophets or seers. So even back then, it seems like they had specialized roles for interpreting signs.
So like a whole profession built around reading the will of the gods.
Exactly.
But I mean, it is tricky, right? Trying to interpret these ancient tablets, it's easy to kind of project our own ideas onto them.
You always got to be careful about that. We can't assume they saw things exactly the same way we do.
Right. So what can we actually glean from those tablets? What can they really tell us?
Well, there's this one word, gerasija, that pops up a lot.
Gerasisha.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
What does it mean?
We think it's connected to the Homeric word teres, which basically means like a sign or a portent. And it often shows up on tablets that are about olive oil offerings.
So even in these ancient tablets, we're seeing that early inductive type of prophecy, looking at the world, interpreting the signs.
Seems that way. It suggests a long, long tradition of this kind of prophecy, going back further than we maybe imagined.
It's amazing to see these threads of continuity. Like, we're talking about myths, poetry, ancient tablets. It all comes together to paint this picture of how the Greeks sought knowledge and understanding. But I am curious about those symbols you mentioned earlier, like the bees, the cauldrons, the caves. What do those tell us about how oracles evolved?
Those symbols are really interesting. They point to a world where, the quest for knowledge was really deeply intertwined with ideas about renewal, about rebirth. And that's where I think we should pick up in part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, listeners, we'll be back soon with part 2. We'll delve into those symbols and see what else we can uncover about the fascinating world of ancient Greek oracles.
So those symbols, let's start with the bee. Now, you might not think of bees as particularly mystical, but they've actually long been associated with the idea of renewal.
Yeah, I can kind of see that. The whole transformation thing, like from larva to worker bee to, the queen bee eventually. It's a whole life cycle of, like, death and rebirth.
Exactly. And that symbolism is really tied to oracles, too. In fact, the Pythia, the priestess at Delphi, she was sometimes called Melissa, which means bee.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
And if you remember Glaucus, our friend who drowned in honey itself is produced by bees, and it has this symbolic meaning. It can represent death, but also this potential for renewal.
Just like Glaucus being brought back to life.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Yeah.
And then there's the cauldron, that other symbol we mentioned.
Yeah.
It might not seem obvious at first, but think about what a cauldron does. It's a vessel for change.
Yeah.
Right? Things are mixed, they're heated, they transform into something new.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. Like in those old myths where heroes are boiled in cauldrons to become younger or stronger. It's a little graphic.
A bit gruesome.
But yeah, definitely about renewal.
Right. And at Delphi, the Pythia actually sat on a tripod cauldron during her prophecies. Maybe it symbolized her own renewal as a conduit for the divine.
Interesting. Okay, so the bee, the cauldron. We've got these themes of renewal, transformation. But what about the cave? Caves feel a little more, I don't know, ominous to me, like darkness, secrets, not so much rebirth.
You're right. Caves can represent the underworld, those chthonic deities,
Right.
But caves also played a role in rituals of renewal. Remember, even the myth of Glaucus, it involves a cave. And at Delphi, the Adaton, that space where the Pythia gave her prophecies, it was kind of like a cave.
So like a gateway to this other realm where you might encounter these, forces of renewal.
Exactly. A place where you can tap into something bigger than yourself. And these three symbols, the bee, the cauldron, and the cave, they actually point to something interesting about this idea of divinely inspired prophecy.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, what if this type of prophecy, where the god speaks directly through the oracle, what if it came from older rituals, ones focused on renewal, on those chthonic deities?
So, like, Apollo, the god of light and reason, Maybe he adopted some of those symbols, those practices, when he became associated with this new form of oracle.
It's definitely a possibility. It adds another layer to those pronouncements at Delphi. And speaking of Apollo, it's interesting to think about his relationship with Dionysus at Delphi.
Wait, Dionysus, the god of wine and partying. That seems like a strange combination.
It does, doesn't it? But remember, Dionysus is also a god connected to cycles of death and rebirth, just like those themes of renewal we've been talking about. And at Delphi, Dionysus was said to, rule during the winter months when Apollo was away.
Oh, I see. So they represent two sides of the same coin, in a way. Apollo, order, reason, and Dionysus, the wilder side of nature.
Exactly. It shows that the Greeks, they had this complex understanding of the divine, of the gods. And in fact, if you think about those Orphic myths, they talk about Dionysus being torn apart and then reborn. Some scholars think those myths might have reflected rituals that were performed at Delphi.
Wow, that's a powerful image. Destruction and creation, all tied together.
Right. And this whole shift toward inspirational prophecy, it didn't happen out of nowhere. It emerged during this really interesting period, the Archaic period in Greece.
Right, a time of upheaval, new ideas. You mentioned the mystery cults before.
Exactly. It was a time when people were really looking for new ways to connect with the gods. They wanted meaning in a world that felt increasingly complex. And this idea of, a god speaking directly to you, well, that must have been incredibly powerful.
So instead of just observing signs, they wanted a more direct connection, a personal experience.
Exactly. And this desire for a deeper relationship with the divine, you see it in the growing popularity of mystery cults, too.
It's like they were seeking a deeper kind of knowledge.
A deeper understanding, yes.
Yeah.
And in this context, we see another fascinating figure emerge, the Sibyl.
The Sibyl, the prophetess.
That's right. She's like the embodiment of this trend toward inspirational prophecy, shrouded in mystery, those wild pronouncements.
So we've got all these pieces coming together, the symbols of renewal, this new type of prophecy, and this yearning for a deeper connection with the divine.
Right. It's a fascinating time. And then to complete the picture, we have to talk about Orpheus.
Orpheus, the musician.
Sweet. That's the one. He's interesting because he bridges this gap between Apollo, the god of prophecy, and the mysteries associated with Dionysus. He's got that artistic inspiration, the prophetic vision, and that connection to those spiritual initiations.
So he embodies that yearning for connection through creativity and those ecstatic experiences.
Exactly. And what's remarkable is how all these seemingly different elements, Glaucos drowning in honey, the symbols of bees and cauldrons and caves, figures like Dionysus, the Sibyl, Orpheus, they all point to this deep connection between oracles and this ancient idea of renewal.
It's like we've uncovered this hidden web of meaning.
And that connection, it isn't just a fleeting thing in Greek history. It endures. Yeah. Think about the Eleusinian mysteries, those secret rituals.
Right, the ones about the afterlife. What do those have to do with oracles?
Well, even though there's no evidence of an actual underground chamber, that myth of a journey to the underworld, to this cave-like realm, it remains central to their tradition.
So even in a ritual that's seemingly pretty different from Delphi, we still see those same symbols, that same language, caves, the underworld, pointing back to that idea of renewal.
Precisely. And you find this connection all over ancient Greece, the sanctuary of Apollo Hylates in Cyprus.
Yeah.
His oracular cave, it was right next to the path used for the mysteries of Aphrodite.
So it's like all these threads are woven together.
And it's through understanding how the ancient Greeks navigated all this that we can gain insights into our own search for knowledge, for meaning, for connection, even in today's world.
It really is amazing to think how much these ancient symbols and stories still resonate with us today. But we've covered so much in this deep dive. Started with bird signs and ended up in the underworld. So what does it all mean? What does this evolution of oracles from those practical interpretations to the pronouncements from the gods tell us about how the Greeks viewed their relationship with the divine?
I think it really highlights a fundamental shift, a change in their religious thought. Early on, the focus was on trying to understand the God's will. Observing the world around them, trying to decipher those signs.
Like those inductive prophecies in Homer, right?
Exactly. It was about skilled interpretation, knowledge, using what you see to understand the gods.
Right.
But then as we move into the Archaic period, we see this shift. People start looking for something more, a more personal connection with the gods. We see purification rituals, ecstatic experiences, those pronouncements from oracles that offer a more direct connection.
So it's like moving from an external approach to something more internal.
Exactly. It's a change in focus, and it really mirrors other big changes in Greek culture at the time. The rise of individualism, questioning authority, exploring new ideas.
So the evolution of oracles, it wasn't just about prophecy. It was about how people understood themselves, their place in the cosmos, their relationship with the gods.
It's all connected. And it leads to a really interesting question, I think, for all of us.
Okay, I'm all ears. Hit me with it. What's the takeaway for us living in, a very different world?
Think about this. The ancient Greeks, they were drawn to both rational inquiry, that careful observation and interpretation of the world, but also this desire for spiritual experience, that connection to something bigger than themselves. How do those two impulses exist in our own lives today?
That's a big question. I mean, we rely on science, on reason to understand the world. But at the same time, so many of us find meaning in spiritual practices, in art, in music, those moments that give us a sense of awe, of connection to something larger.
Right. It's a tension, this balance that has been with us for centuries. And maybe by looking at how the Greeks navigated this, we can understand our own search for knowledge and meaning a little better.
Well, listeners, we've certainly done a lot of exploring in this deep dive. Hopefully, we've sparked some curiosity about ancient Greek oracles. I know I've learned a lot.
It's been a fascinating journey. And remember, keep seeking, keep questioning, keep exploring.
And maybe, just maybe, you'll have a divinely inspired moment of your own.